Welcome. Welcome to the session on geography of changing lands and seas. My name's Gil Pontius. I will be your MC and first presenter. I will be one of 4 15-minute presentations by me and my colleagues here. First, to my immediate right is Professor Deb Martin, and then Professor John Rogan, Professor Lyndon Estes, and Professor Karen Fry. And we are going to immediately warm up your brains. So I'll give you a moment to read this. Keep in mind, I know who you are. Dan, Sebastian, Yuko, Tammy. We might call on one of you to ask, who do you believe when your government warns that 10% of your neighbors have a deadly contagious virus? The producer of a diagnostic test advertises that 90% of its tests are correct. The test indicates that you have the virus. Your Clark geography professor, that would be me, claims that you have a 50% chance of having the virus given the above information. Okay, Dan, it's you. Who do you believe? Correct, Dan. You came to the right place. Let's get Dan a hand. He's right on. Okay, but Dan was answering safely, because actually, if Dan would have answered any of the others, he would have not necessarily been wrong. In fact, it's possible that all of these are true simultaneously. How can that be? Well, that's what I spend my time thinking about and teaching a course that David, who's in the audience, and others have taken about how to make generalizable methods based on mathematical concepts that are also applicable to geography. So what we have here is a table, and in the columns are the categories of the truth. Either you have the virus or you don't have the virus. And in the rows are the results of the test. The test says you either have the virus or you don't have the virus. So the first claim was from the government, that 10% of your neighbors have a deadly contagious virus. So if we envision your neighborhood as 100% of your neighborhood, which is in the lower right, then in the column under truth, you have 10% of your neighborhood has the virus. Now, the producer of the diagnostic test is going to guarantee that its tests are 90% correct, regardless of the prevalence of the disease in the population. Well, how do they know that? Well, in the laboratory, they've done their experiments and realized that if they test someone who does have the virus, they're going to diagnose correctly 90% of the time. And if they diagnose someone who does not have the virus, the test is correct 90% of the time. And so we're going to take each of these columns, we're going to take that 10 and distribute it above, as 9 of it goes into you do have the virus and the test says you have the virus, and 1 of them goes below that. For the 90% of the people who do not have the virus, well, 90% of them go into that entry that has 81, because 90% of 90 is 81. And then 9 people essentially have false positives, false alarms. Now, your test comes back and it says you have the virus. So that means you're in the row that the test says you do have the virus. Well, in that row, there's 9 people who actually do have the virus and 9 who don't. And so of the 18 people in that row, half of them have the virus. And so that's how all 3 of those bits of information can be simultaneously true. But what I get concerned about is you hear on the radio, oh, well, the test is 90% correct. So people think, well, it's believable. It's like, well, you need to think a little bit more deeply about this. Because if you look at that, look at how many people actually have the virus. 10. How many people tested positive for the virus? 18. That's nearly double. So if you're giving advice to the hospital about how many people are sick based on just their test results, you're going to be dramatically overestimating the number of people who are sick. Well, what does this have to do with geography? Well, there's medical geography is phenomenally important, but Clark geography, and especially my field and the field of others, focuses on one of our areas of expertise is land change, of how the seas and lands are changing. And so this same analogy applies directly to what we're doing here in Clark geography. So for example, here, with this example, the number of tests of positive for the virus is much larger than the actual number. But we analyze matrices exactly like this when we get satellite images, and then we convert those satellite images into maps. And then we go on the ground and see the category on the ground and compare that to what's the category in the map. So in this case, it's the map that's making the diagnosis, and the truth is what we see on the ground. So we can see this exact same example with some of the work that my colleagues do. So Professor John Rogan is an expert in applied remote sensing. So you can imagine one of Rogan's students using remote sensing to make a map that shows 18% of your neighborhood trees have an invasive beetle. Not unheard of in Massachusetts. Well, our Clark students, because they've taken our class, knows that the map, when they compare the map to what's on the ground, that the map is 90% correct, but also knows that 90% correct can be a remarkably misleading metric, especially because it seems that it's so easily understood. So the student appropriately tells the media that 10% of the neighborhood's trees have the invasive beetle, even when 18% of the map shows that it has the invasive beetle. Boy, so if you look at what's in the table, there's really only 4 numbers, but you have to think about those pretty carefully in order to not make a mistaken claim. Now, this relates to much of my work that's funded by the National Science Foundation, and actually we just submitted another multi-million-dollar grant this year, and National Science Foundation has been funding this site with me and my colleagues at Clark and also at the Marine Biological Lab to analyze land change in the Plum Island ecosystems in northeastern Massachusetts. And we are blessed in Massachusetts to have a phenomenal state agency, MassGIS, who has maps of the entirety of Massachusetts. And so we zoomed in on our particular study area. They have a time series from 1971, and notice, well, the 2 most prominent categories there are green is forest and red is urban. It's urban, it's residential, built up area. And so there's the map of 1971, 1985, 1991, and 1999. So you see a big conversion from forest to residential, and then came the map of 2005. We got the map of 2005, and when that was released, that seemed to show that all of the forest lost during 1971 to 1999 regrew in that 6 years. Like, that threw a wrench into the slogan of the Audubon Society, who was, was giving metrics of forest loss. Well, the reason is that the state used a different method to create the 2005 map than they used to create the previous maps. And so Clark students learn that it is remarkably challenging to make a time series of maps such that the temporal difference in the maps really show the change on the ground. So I'll leave you with this, this brain teaser, which I've heard many times right here in Massachusetts. The environmentalists say that residential development causes most of the deforestation in Massachusetts. Developers claim that they actually try to avoid deforestation and actually prefer to build on agricultural land. Who do you believe? Well, it's possible to believe both simultaneously by looking at a very similar table. So if you see in the rows of this table are the categories at the initial time, and the columns are the categories at the subsequent time. And if you look at the far right column, the sum, you'll see that at the initial time, there's 3 times more forest than there is agriculture. So if developers were developing uniformly across the landscape, you'd expect them to take when they develop, take 3 times more land from forest than from agriculture. But if you look in the built column of time 2, they're only taking twice as much land from forest as they do to agriculture. So this is another of methods that for which we've designed the equations, and now we're designing the software, which we will be very important to incorporate into our new merging Center for Geospatial Technology. But if you want to get a sneak preview at all the equations, you can either register for my class in the fall, or you can learn it immediately by buying the book. I just finished authoring my first book, and now it's available on Springer. So that's, now I'd like to introduce the professors of the HERO program, Professor Deb Martin and John Rogan.
Thank you very much, Gil. My name is John Rogan, and my colleague Deborah Martin and I are going to present briefly on the Human Environment Regional Observatory, or HERO program. This is a program that has been in existence continuously for 23 years at Clark. 2 years from now, we'll be on our quarter-century mark. And some important numbers for you. It began in 1999 with an investment from the John T. O'Connor Fund, and that fund has sustained HERO over the 23 years. It was founded by David Angel, a former president of Clark, of course, and Billy Turner, who was a former faculty member here. And we've mentored approximately 180 undergraduate students in research who start in the summer and then work through the fall and spring. To give you a sense of what we've done over the years, we've worked on projects of social and political importance as they've arisen, and those have varied based on the interests of faculty and students. In the early days, we looked at the drivers and causes of land change in Massachusetts, and Gil was involved at that stage. It evolved to work with National Science Foundation money on lawn care and decision-making in areas around Massachusetts. And with the outbreak of the longhorn beetle infestation in the 2 neighborhoods north of Worcester, Burncoat and Greendale neighborhoods, that was led us down that path to look at the causes and consequences of the invasive beetle. Following that, with the response to the beetle tree removal by the USDA, we focused on a program called Greening the Gateway Cities, which is a program launched by the state and the Department of Conservation and Recreation in Massachusetts. And most recently, we've begun to work with the City of Worcester on their Green Worcester plan. So over time, our interests and challenges have evolved. This is a page from a flyer that we used to promote HERO. And I think what's most interesting about it is the quote we have from one of our HERO fellows right in the middle. Savannah Sanford says, "There is no syllabus for this. This is not like a typical undergraduate research project involving a research paper, and where you can use the internet and lab experiments in class. This was longer and more interactive. We are the researchers, and we're going out collecting the data." So that, from the student's mouth, that's a good representation of what we do.
So, and as Savannah said, we are the researchers. One of the things we wanted to highlight was the ways that students are involved all the way through to including being involved in publications. And in fact, I think I have 6 particular published articles mentioned on this slide, and 3 of them were lead authored by undergraduate students at Clark. So I'm just going to sort of summarize some of the kinds of findings that we've had, and reflecting John's biogeographical expertise and my more sort of social science, urban policy expertise. We look at environmental impacts, and so seeing, even though the longhorn beetle infestation caused all kinds of devastation and real landscape change, particularly in the 2 neighborhoods that John mentions, we actually lose more trees every year based to routine development. So that was one of the findings we had. We also were able to document the way that loss in tree canopy has an actual local impact on local land surface temperatures, and that it can extend the summer warm period. And then on the more sort of social science, urban policy side, we were able to identify the ways that in Worcester, but we argue also elsewhere, ecological vulnerability actually has cycles, and what happens in one cycle and the policy decisions that are made lead to other kinds of vulnerability that need to be adapted to in future. So in the case of Worcester, the classic is that in 1953, there was a big tornado, and then they planted a bunch of Norway maples, which were prime location for the infestation of the longhorn beetle. We've also looked at the importance of public-private multi-government collaboration in responding and providing capacity locally for, again, adaptation and response to an ecological crisis like the longhorn beetle, and the ways that risk communication needs to be attentive to different kinds of the way that stakeholders understand their place risk differently by where they are emplaced. In terms of the tree planting initiative work that we've done, we've looked a lot at tree survivorship, which is very important. If you're going to spend a lot of money planting trees, those trees need to survive to have an impact. And so some of the most important indicators of survivorship are the degree to which they're stewarded very early. Watering and caring for the trees in the first couple of years are very important, and that itself determines the proportion of the trees that will survive, as does the kind of landowner or the land steward. Having good property, attentive to stewardship plans, particularly on rental property, is incredibly important. We're also able to document the economic impacts of those planted trees, and again, speak to the role of funding and planning for managing an ecological plan that involves not just planting trees, but ensuring their survivorship over time, which means funding for stewardship plans and staff to ensure that those happen. In terms of the other kinds of things that students do, they have all kinds of engagements with stakeholders and policymakers. And so we just want to talk a little bit about, at the end of every summer, the students present their preliminary findings and what they've been working on, and they're usually able to do that to local agencies, government officials, people who are actually involved in policy, and who can ask questions that then often lead to new research questions that we pursue in the following year and summer. They also do just basic community work, understanding their partners, like the Worcester Tree Initiative. What kinds of things is the organization doing in the community, and how can they help with those kinds of efforts? So they've been involved in cleanups and tree plantings. They also go to national conferences and present their findings at those conferences. And then finally, again, they engage with the communities in understanding what are the issues and problems. So when you understand what it means to plant a tree well, when you come back 2 years later to see how that tree is doing, which our students do, and measure growth metrics and see how healthy the trees are, they understand some of the what might have happened in those 2 years in terms of whether the tree was properly mulched and not just watered, but whether it was anchored properly against wind and things like that. And then they talk to people. They talk to people who aren't just policymakers, but they talk to people who live in the neighborhoods where trees are planted or trees are being cut down, and they understand sort of the local place identities that are shaped and the communities that they're working in.
Okay, and to follow on, Deb, the importance of engagement isn't possible without the strong partnerships we have with collaborators. And this is a quote from Ruth Seward, who's the former director of the Worcester Tree Initiative. That was the nonprofit that started after the longhorn beetle tree removal, which was enormously successful. Students of the HERO program have conducted valuable research on tree establishment in Worcester and the other gateway cities. Their findings are a meaningful resource for community forestry efforts statewide. And at the state level, this is Matt Cahill, excuse me, who is the former director of Greening the Gateway Cities. The partnership has helped us to analyze changes in microclimates, which has saved us time and money, and continues to the benefit of the Greening the Gateway Cities program, which is ongoing. Something that we all know well is that in March 2020, we all had to change our priorities in many ways. And so we were still able to keep HERO going because after 20 years, we didn't want to see it finish or even be delayed. So we were able to leverage the Clark University's forest, which is called the Hadwin Arboretum, and be able to engage with students that summer, socially distanced, masked, outdoors. And again, you see Ruth Seward there from Worcester Tree Initiative helping us plan a planting program there. And it's one of the positives that have come from COVID-19, or maybe the only one really. And so that's just a demonstration of the flexibility that's embedded in HERO as new challenges and opportunities arise. So you may be wondering, where are they now? This is just a snapshot of a few of the HERO students who have been in the program and the years that they were in the program. And you can see from Yanette Ruiz, who is a flood risk assessor in Houston, Texas, to Shannon Palmer, who's assistant principal at Success Academy in Brooklyn, New York. These are students who are now alumni, and we're in contact with a good many of them as well. So with that, we'll stop, and I want to acknowledge that the John T. O'Connor Fund has sustained HERO through the years, but we've also received funding from the George Perkins Marsh Institute, the National Science Foundation, and the Moszkowski Institute. And special thanks to these individuals who are listed there, the stakeholders and the partners and the collaborators who have been instrumental in helping us move our program forward. So thank you, and we will pass it on to our colleague, Lyndon Estes.
Thank you. All right, so thanks. Yeah, I'm Lyndon Estes. I'm an associate professor in the Graduate School of Geography, and I'm going to talk to you about research that my group does, applying new geospatial technologies to understand agricultural change and its impacts. So our work is motivated by the rapid agricultural change that's unfolding in many parts of the world, but particularly in Africa, where we expect food demand to triple by 2050. And meeting that food demand is going to require at least 140 million hectares of new cropland to be developed to meet the demand. Just to put that in context, that's an area that's equal to 1/5 of the lower 48 of the United States. So that large-scale transformation is going to have major socioeconomic and environmental impacts, such as exacerbating the climate change that's already underway, and thereby further increasing the significant weather-related risk that millions of farmers in the region face. So we're interested in understanding what is going to be the exact nature of these impacts, what can be done to minimize the negative environmental impacts, and what can be done to enhance positive outcomes, such as boosting productivity and the resilience of farming systems in the region. So to answer those questions and to find such solutions, we need several critical data sets. Basically, we need accurate maps that are detailed and updated regularly that show us where croplands are located, what the characteristics of the fields are in those croplands, what kind of crops are growing, and what the yields are of those crops. Unfortunately, those data sets really don't exist for most countries at the moment, and so we have to create them. And the only feasible way to create those is by using remote sensing or satellite image analysis. So that presents a problem because we're in this region, most of the farming is still practiced by smallholders. And remote sensing of smallholder agriculture is particularly difficult for a variety of reasons. For one, the types of imagery we typically use does not have the detail or the frequency of collection to reliably detect the small, frequently shifting fields that are common in these systems. And then the characteristics of those fields themselves, which tend to blend in with their surrounding vegetation, confuse the machine learning algorithms that we use to convert imagery into maps. Those algorithms themselves require large amounts of training data that has to basically, or ground truth data that has to be basically examples that we show the algorithm so that they can learn to detect pattern within the imagery. Such data are very difficult to collect on the ground. It's expensive and they're often error-prone themselves. So the mapping enterprise itself is quite a challenge. Fortunately, there's been several recent technological advances in just the past 5 to 10 years that are rapidly improving our ability to map accurately in these systems. These include the launch of many new satellites that are providing low-cost data that are high resolution and frequently updated. The rising power and falling cost of cloud computing, which you need to handle such large volumes of imagery, and then really rapid increases in the quality and capability of machine learning algorithms, together with growing internet penetration through cell phones that allows you to collect lots of training data for these algorithms. So I'm going to talk to you about 3 projects that we're doing that tries to leverage these advances. One of them is a project in Ghana that tries to improve agricultural extension services. The second is an effort to track long-term agricultural change in Zambia. And the third is an effort to balance conservation interest with agricultural development in Tanzania. So I'll start with the first project. This is a project that's a collaboration between us here at Clark University and Farmerline, which is the lead organization in this project. They're an innovative agricultural technology company and farm services provider based in Ghana. So our project is part of a larger effort called Enabling Crop Analytics at Scale, which is funded by the Gates Foundation and led by Tetra Tech, which is trying to increase the uptake of geospatial technology in smallholder farming systems. So our particular project under this larger umbrella project is trying to basically figure out a way to sustainably create accurate maps of crop types, what crop types are growing in specific fields, and update that annually. And that is information that we can then use to create better extension services for smallholder farmers. So our approach is basically got two main legs to it. One is trying to figure out innovative methods for collecting ground truth data that tells us what crops are growing in what fields in different seasons. The second is then to use that data set, those sets of data, to train advanced machine learning algorithms, which we apply to next generation satellites to try map the crop types themselves. So I just want to first acknowledge that there's quite a significant number of people involved in this. We have our colleagues at Farmerline who are the lead on this, as well as a drone services provider based in Ghana. But I also just want to highlight the many students that are involved here at Clark University from every level of PhD through master's to the undergraduate level. And these students are responsible themselves for developing every part of the mapping workflow, from the image processing through to the really innovative development and application of the machine learning algorithms that we do to do the mapping. I also would like to point out that it involves collaboration with other groups that not mentioned here, such as Clark Labs, that we've been doing this work with for several years now. And funding has come primarily from Tetra Tech, but also initially by Omidyar Network's Property Rights Initiative, now Place, and with computing support provided by Amazon Web Services. So I just want to quickly look at the methods here for you. So we have 2 approaches to collecting the ground truth data. The primary way is through Farmerline's network of extension agents. They use their innovative merge data platform, which is farm management software that they've developed and which Time Magazine actually named as one of the best inventions of 2019. So they go and they work with their network of enrolled farmers, and they go and visit them and collect the boundaries of crop fields there and record what crop is growing in the field. On top of this, we've developed an approach for collecting samples with drone data, where we collect near-surface imagery that's got enough detail for us to recognize the crop types within them, that extends the range and reach of the data sets we can collect that provides our ground truth. So in the past few months or the last half of 2021, we collected 192 drone images. They're shown there in the blue and red points on the map there in northern and central Ghana, and 5,000 fields visited by agents and their boundaries delineated. So we harmonize those 2 data sets based on where the field agents work and the drones overlap. And then we use that as training data, and that's those blue points there. That's where the areas of overlap. We use those data to train our machine learning algorithms. So this has 2 steps. The first step is an approach that we've developed over the past several years, which allows us to map the boundaries of individual fields at the country scale on an annual basis. This approach is based on deep learning models, convolutional neural networks applied to CubeSat imagery, which is basically small low-cost satellites operated by a company called Planet that collects daily imagery at less than 5-meter resolution, and which allows us to basically create these annually updated maps. So you can see here an example of 3 maps that we've developed for 2018, 2020, and 2021. And you can see that the boundaries of each of the fields are delineated. And if you look at the synthesis of these 3 maps, you can see actually how much these systems are shifting each year. So it's really critical to be able to have a map that's updated on an annual basis to be able to track what's happening in those fields. So that brings us to the second step, which is to actually try and map the crop types in those fields. And to do that, we have another set of models, including a different flavor of convolutional neural network that's designed to work with time series data, which we apply to a different set of satellite data, including the European Space Agency's Sentinel-1 radar imagery. And so we use that to predict what crops are growing within the boundaries of those fields we developed in the previous step. And this is an example here where we have predictions for maize, rice, and other crops. So now that's data that FarmerLine is using to develop a whole bunch of enhanced knowledge and services for smallholder farmers and the businesses that serve them. For example, knowing where specific crop types are growing in which regions enables FarmerLine to provide more tailored advice to farmers. For example, what seed varieties they should use and how much fertilizer they should apply to them. Similarly, they can also tell agribusinesses that are basically distributing these seeds and fertilizers where they should, distribute their efforts more effectively. So this is hopefully information that is going to improve the outcomes and productivity for smallholder farmers. So that's one project. The second project I want to talk about quickly is our efforts in Zambia to track long-term agricultural change. Zambia is a country that's been undergoing some of the most rapid agricultural expansion in Africa. So we're interested in understanding what is the impact of that agricultural growth. And we eventually want to use it to understand how yield trends are evolving. Is productivity increasing? Is it becoming more sensitive to climate change and climate variability? And questions like that. So this is part of projects that have been funded by NASA and the National Science Foundation for several years. And so a first step in this project is being able to simply create a map to show how the agriculture has changed in those 20-year time periods. So to do that, to create those sets of maps, we're using long-term time series based on NASA's Landsat satellite together with radar. And we've developed a probabilistic mapping approach that's implemented in Google's Earth Engine platform, which is a cloud computing platform that's become widely used in the past few years and is really revolutionizing how remote sensing analyses are being done. So we've done that to detect where the croplands are in the year it's expanded in. And the result is this map that you see here, which is all of Zambia. This has just been produced. And it shows us where cropland is expanded from each year between 2000 and 2015. And you can see the year in which a new field was made by the color coding in those insets. I'd like to flag that this is work that has been led by a PhD student here, Sitian Shung, is in geography, as well as by a recent master's in GIS graduate, Priscilla Baltazar. And what's also quite special about this work is that they've initiated and sustained a collaboration with McGill University to do this work. So I'd like to flag that as an important achievement as well in its own right. So this map provides us with the base that we need to understand that long-term agricultural change in Zambia. Finally, I'm going to talk to you about a third project here, which is led by Lei Song, a graduate student, a PhD student in geography, also using funding from a NASA fellowship. This is focused on Tanzania, and the objective is to understand really how elephants are moving and using the landscape in Tanzania and how they're moving between agricultural areas and natural habitats. And so this is in order to basically provide or offer solutions that can be used to help with things like land use planning. How do you better balance where agriculture and conservation lands are placed by understanding how elephants need to use and migrate between habitats? So the approach for this starts with developing a high-resolution land cover map, which is then used as the basis for studying elephant movements within the larger landscape. So this is the first work that Leigh's just produced. It's a really quite a remarkable achievement. This is a countrywide map of Tanzania, which I believe is 4 times the size of Texas at 5-meter resolution, showing all the major land cover types, particularly where cropland is in relation to other natural habitats. And so this was developed again using an innovative deep learning approach together with CubeSat imagery, and now provides the foundation for that movement, elephant movement analysis. So I'm going to stop there, and I just hope that these examples give you a sense of the type of real revolution that's happening in geospatial analytical capabilities at the moment, and how we're using them here at Clark to improve our understanding of how agricultural change and other types of land change processes are happening. So I'll turn it over to my colleague Karen Fry now. Thanks.
Thank you, that was great. Thank you to my colleagues so far. My name is Karen Fry. I am also in the Graduate School of Geography. I've been here since 2007. I've had the great fortune to have all sorts of different projects funded by all sorts of different sources, but even greater fortune to have worked with some really incredible students along the way, undergraduates, master's students, PhD students, many of which you can see here. Many of the pictures that you see here are students that have gone on to be professors of earth science, of geography, of environmental science. We have a diversity, equity, and inclusion of STEM at UMass Amherst in these pictures. We have many GIS analysts at NASA, at the Environmental Defense Fund, at all sorts of different consulting agencies. So we've been really, really fortunate to have some really incredible students that have helped to develop polar research at Clark in particular. So if you were to look at all of the work that has come out of our lab since I've been here, and if you were to look at all of the keywords of all of the work along the way, they tend to fall out in 3 different lobes, if you will, of my particular research. We have sea ice in Arctic marine ecosystems, glacier, ice sheets, and snowmelt dynamics in terrestrial realms, and then the biogeochemistry of permafrost environments, which is basically perennially frozen soil. A lot of this work has been across Siberia, as you can see in the maps in the upper left-hand corner, also in Greenland, in the North Slope of Alaska, and also in Antarctica. In terms of methods, my work is sort of at the triple point of field observations, modeling, and also remote sensing and geospatial analysis. For this particular talk, we're sort of focused on the remote sensing GIS analysis side of things, so I'll sort of keep my examples to that side of things. But we really kind of are at the nexus of all 3 of these methodologies along the way. And we have had students from Clark go to places in all of the stars that you see there. We've had students do field work on ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica. We've had students, numerous students, go to the peatlands of Siberia. Most recently, we've had students come along to do field work with me on icebreakers. This coming summer, I have 2 students coming with me on a Canadian icebreaker that will be up in the Bering and the Chukchi Seas surrounding Alaska. So why do we study these areas in the first place? If you look at the green line there, that basically is what global temperatures have done since pre-industrial, since the late 1800s. If you look at the blue line, that basically is what Arctic latitudes have done. And for a long time, we sort of had the basic byline that Arctic temperatures are warming twice as fast as sort of global averages. But it turns out, if you look at sort of more recent research, it turns out that Arctic latitudes are actually warming up to 4 times faster than the global average, due to all sorts of different things, primarily due to the fact that we are replacing some of the brightest things on the planet, such as snow and ice. And we're replacing that with some of the darkest things on the planet, such as dark forests and ocean surfaces. So it's always great to kind of see these line plots, but always, obviously, as a geographer, we're very interested in understanding the spatial variability of these changes as well. So obviously, you can see the animation on the right kind of giving you a sense of really how important these high latitudes are for overall climate change. So just kind of focusing on one of those lobes of research, here I'm just going to show a couple different examples as it relates specifically to sea ice ecosystems. We do a lot of field work And so it's really important to kind of get our boots on the ground to understand what's going on at these particular locations. You can see on the left a sort of a primary example of what sea ice might look like in March in the Bering Sea. So very bright white, very high albedo, very reflective surfaces. This is sort of a day when I went out off the ship and had my eyelashes frozen closed. It's very, very cold and very windy. On the right, however, as you sort of start to see that sea ice start to melt back, you can see that those bright surfaces really get replaced by some of the darkest things on the planet, which in this case is ocean water. So very, very important in terms of the sensitivity of overall climate with these high latitude environments. With these field opportunities, you can only be in one place at one time. Right, so you really important for calibrating things, really important for validating and sort of really understanding what our remote sensing satellite imagery is telling us. But you do have certain limitations in terms of, as I said, being in one place at one time. Sort of as we start to incorporate satellite imagery, we can really get a sense of sort of what the overarching trends seem to be. And in terms of sea ice decline, when we look at the seasonal minimum of sea ice in the Arctic, this essentially is what the trend has looked like based on satellite imagery. And so you can see these particular satellite time series were started in the late 1970s. You can certainly see that we've had some really interesting sort of anomalous lows over the last several years. The current sort of record is 2012. 2020 was also a relatively low year that almost beat out 2007, which was a really big tipping point in these particular observations. But if you look at trends over time, we essentially have lost overall about 81,000 square kilometers per year, which may not sound like a whole lot, but if you think about that contextually, it's about losing the size of the state of South Carolina per year. The Arctic is not a huge place. So think about basically the state of South Carolina being removed, one of those being removed every single year over the last 42 years of our satellite record. And you can kind of get a sense of what the spatial variability of that looked like as well. In the red line, you can see that's the 1981 to 2010 average seasonal minimum versus what 2020 did. So the loss of Arctic sea ice is really critical in all sorts of different ways. As I said, in terms of these field observations, you can only be in one place at one time, but really critical for understanding and interpreting these satellite images in the first place. So if I were to take you with me all the way up to the Arctic, put you on a ship, dock that ship up against a really big, nice, sturdy sea ice floe and walk off that ship, as we do, and basically stand on top of that sea ice, on top of perhaps 4,000 meters of ocean water beneath you. This essentially is what you would find. So I've taken a GoPro camera and just sort of attached it to my instrumentation, and I've let it through the sea ice surface, as you see here, letting things just go hand over hand over hand. If you could look closely, you can actually see my hand through that hole there. But as you're looking at things, you start to see some really remarkable patterns of what light transmittance does through the sea ice surface. And as it turns out, melt ponds, and as the sea ice starts to melt back, matters tremendously for the amount of light that is actually available in the ocean in the first place. And so, for instance, if you were to look at the sea ice at the top there, you can kind of get a sense of what those melt ponds look like. They're very dark. And as it turns out, because of the low albedo and the sort of the high absorption of that surface in terms of the melting, it actually takes that light and allows that light to transmit through the sea ice surface. So if you look at that sea ice from below, what you see essentially is the photographic negative of what you're seeing from above. So in other words, because of the low albedo and the high transmittance of light through there, these melt ponds that you're seeing basically act as skylights. And in a case where we didn't have these melt ponds, you might only let 10% of light through. In the case of increased melting, and in the severe case of decline of ice altogether, these melt ponds can actually let up to 70 or 80% of incident light through these sea ice surfaces. So really, really important for generating heat, for sort of allowing things like photosynthesis to occur in the water, among other things along the way. So we can take those types of hypotheses that we place to kind of get a sense of, first of all, what is sea ice doing across the region. So these are our particular field sites that you see here on the left. And that's using sort of spatial analysis to have a sense of how fast sea ice decline in these areas is actually occurring. And so the deeper reds are indicating a stronger decline of sea ice. The cool colors are denoting increases in sea ice. You don't see a whole lot of those cooler colors by any means. But in those really deep areas of red, this is a 20-year record. So per decade, we're losing up to about 60 days of sea ice cover per year, which means over the 20-year time series, we're losing 120 days or 4 months of sea ice cover. So it's massively changing, not only the physical systems of these areas, but the ecosystems that rely on these physical environments in the first place. We can also sort of use, for instance, not only sort of the observations of sea ice, but we can actually look at the color of the ocean water as well to tell us something about what is going on in terms of photosynthesis. You've probably heard a lot of my colleagues today at this session and others talk about the importance of terrestrial ecosystems. But when we think about photosynthesis across the planet, terrestrial ecosystems are only 50% of photosynthesis on the planet. Ocean ecosystems and ocean photosynthesis make up 50% of the other sort of side of the story. So really, really important in terms of understanding how carbon is moving across the planet, how we might mitigate climate change in terms of geoengineering applications, all sorts of different things, but we can't forget about the importance of oceans. So we use these sort of types of colors of the ocean to tell us something about what chlorophyll concentrations and therefore things like primary productivity are doing in our oceans as well. So this is sort of just an example of sort of the low end of the food web, which is incredibly important. Some of the most productive marine ecosystems in the world occur in these Arctic areas. So we can take those satellite images and tell us something about how much grams of carbon we're actually sequestering and how that's changing over time. Here you obviously increases in photosynthesis and in primary productivity over time, which of course has some really severe, dire consequences in terms of shifts in ecosystems that I'm certainly happy to get into more if people have questions sort of in the Q&A. But really the beauty of being able to have these satellite images and time series is it really gives us a holistic perspective of what's going on across the region. We can start to sort of look at how the mean open water season is sort of related to annual primary productivity and to sort of see at our particular sites kind of which is most intimately tied to these particular drivers of sea ice decline to get a sense of whether it's sea ice that's limiting productivity or whether it's things like nutrients and things like that, which are also very, very important. That's an example sort of on the lower end of the food chain. In terms of upper trophics, we have also had some really sort of interesting research projects looking at with sea ice on a much higher spatial scale as well. What you're seeing on the left is an image of Landsat, which is sort of something that all of my colleagues have worked with, and Lyndon in particular talked about as well. But each pixel being sort of 30 meters of area gives us a really clear indication of the shape and morphology of those individual sea ice flows, something that you might not be able to get at with lower spatial resolution data. And this is a picture that I sort of took up in the Bering Sea, but really kind of gives an indication of the type of accuracy that we have with being able to classify those sea ice flows as well. And as it turns out, in terms of getting a sense of the size and the shape and the distribution and the morphology of those individual sea ice flows can tell us an awful lot about the importance and the overall health of sort of larger mammals and the upper trophics in the area, such as the Pacific walrus, which was actually petitioned as a threatened species under the Endangered Species Act that unfortunately was not approved with the Trump administration, but still a really, really sort of important species that has had some really dire impacts from the loss of sea ice decline along the way. This was a project that was actually undertaken in collaboration with myself and Florencia Sangermano, who's also a professor in the department, but led by Anthony Himmelberger, who is a undergraduate, actually, and a fifth-year graduate from Clark. But he, in collaboration, we've just gotten this paper published as with Anthony as a first author, which we're really proud of, but really kind of shows the ability of using sort of other methodologies, not necessarily from oceanography that I have learned from my colleagues along the way, to apply in really novel ways. So for instance, we have used methodologies from the landscape ecology field, trying to understand kind of the shape and the overall morphology of these sea ice flows from the field of looking at sort of landscape fragmentation and landscape sort of habitats and ecosystems. And the beauty of geography is probably clearly one of the most interdisciplinary fields that I can certainly think of, is that I'm constantly learning from my colleagues, constantly learning sort of new methodologies to apply in a really novel new way. And in particular, sort of understanding the morphology and the shape of these sea ice flows, which was originally sort of coming from this landscape ecology field, really kind of gave us an ability to kind of get a sense of, with sea ice coverage and as sea ice coverage going down, how are the shapes of these flows going to change? And as it turns out, as sea ice declines, these sea ice flows actually become rounder, which, as it turns out, is kind of detrimental to walrus because they actually prefer much more broken pack, much more sort of angular types of sea ice flows. And so this is really sort of important contribution to kind of understanding the future fate of Pacific walrus as it relates to sea ice as being a really important part of their overall habitat. And again, thanks to the constant learning that I have from my colleagues, sort of understanding these different types of methodologies to be able to apply in a field such as oceanography was a real sort of benefit, I think, in terms of working with people along that I wouldn't have had I been in, for instance, an earth science department or an oceanography department that's much more streamlined in terms of overall fields. So with that, I just wanted to sort of give a couple examples, and I will leave you all with this photo of some melt ponds. So thank you.
Well, we designed this to have plenty of time for questions. So or comments. We're very much interested in your feedback, or if you want to add something or have a question, we are here to open the discussion with you. Who's going to be first? And we have someone with a microphone, right? You can raise your hand and you will be delivered a microphone. Yes.
Hello, my name is Omesa. Thank you so much all for the wonderful presentations. I'm particularly interested in the presentation with like agricultural change in Africa. So I was intrigued by the fact that almost a third of the world is arable land is in Africa, yet Africa suffers most from food insecurity, which is so kind of paradoxical for me. And with all this research that you're doing, so I'm interested in knowing who are the consumers of the findings and the data you know, with all the research that you're doing. Does it get to do you work with the policymakers, or does it get to the hands of the policymakers? Because you've seen a case of like siloed approach in doing all this, where scientists do the work, but the findings don't get to the people who need to use them to effect change where it's supposed to be used. Yeah, so like, do you work in communities with policymakers in co-creating solutions for some of these issues that you are talking about coming about due to climate change?
Sure. Thanks for the question. Yeah, so I can answer that question in a couple parts. So the first project I mentioned with respect to in Ghana, that's information that's being directly used by Farmerline, which is an agricultural services provider. So they're turning it into the products that are going to serve their customers most effectively. So that, to me, is perhaps the most, one of the most direct ways that the information can benefit. And so they're turning it into the types of information that they think will be most effective. From another standpoint, though, the projects, almost all the projects that I mentioned, are mandated to make the data and the methods open. So all the data sets that we're collecting and making the maps are publicly available, and they have multiple purposes. The maps themselves can be used by policymakers. The better agricultural maps provide you information that can be used by statistical agencies in different governments to make improved estimates of crop production, for one. The a big part of what we do is try to collect better training data sets for machine learning algorithms that are then made public, that can be used with the goal of making them be usable by all sorts of interested parties that are trying to develop improved services and geospatial applications for agriculture. And that's one of the big purposes of that enabling crop analytics at scale project I mentioned. So yes, all of these things are intended to be open, freely available, and to inform policy, or I should say end users, and it's a diversity of end users.
Okay, well, we have other questions, comments?
Hi, Karen. Nathan, fellow oceanographer. So I was going to ask you about your work with the melt ponds. Is there, I can imagine there might be a feedback loop of more light being available for the phytoplankton, and then shielding the light from that growth response. Is something you've looked at, and is, yeah, curious to hear about that.
Yeah, so there are certainly interesting situations where you get so much growth of algae in the ocean such that it shades area deeper in the water column. So even if there are nutrients available, there's not enough light to certainly support that photosynthesis in the first place. One of the bigger sort of challenges in these areas is that in these areas, not only do you have ecosystems in the water column itself, but you also have really important benthic ecosystems as well at the seafloor. And because these areas are very, very shallow, the video that I showed you, that might have been 4,000 meters of water, but over many of these sort of shelf areas, it's really only 30, 40 meters of ocean water. So at the top, it may look like this expansive ocean, but they're really, really shallow. And what that means is that the sort of carbon that gets produced sort of above can also really importantly feed these benthic ecosystems. So I'm sure you all are aware of like deadliest catch and thinking about all of the sort of the king crab that live in these areas. I mean, it's a massive amount of sort of biomass that lives in these areas. And as it turns out, sea ice and the algae that is associated with sea ice specifically is very fatty. It's very lipid rich. It's very heavy. And so, you know, in the early part of the season, if you have a lot of sea ice, all of that sort of sea ice algae is really important for the benthic ecosystems because it drops fast, it's heavy, it's very fatty, right? It feeds all of the benthic ecosystems down there. But with the absence of sea ice and the decline of sea ice algae, those benthic ecosystems are starting to be starved. And so while the water column sort of might be, you know, might be seeing some changes, it's really the benthic ecosystems that are sort of seeing the biggest changes over time. So that's a massive issue for fisheries, certainly from an economic standpoint, but also from a standpoint of walrus. You may not know, but walrus are actually a benthic feeding mammal. So they actually will dive to the bottom of the ocean. They'll dive down those 30 and 40 meters. They'll take a big scoop full of mud, and they're after the clams and mussels and all of that sort of embedded in the mud. And so not only sort of are we worried about the water column, but also the benthic ecosystems as well, which has really sort of cascading influences based on that. So thank you.
Thank you very much for fascinating presentations. I'm Sebastián Royo, I'm the provost, and I have a question. You have presented fact-based evidence of what is happening in the planet and the very negative consequences that it's having. But there's still quite a bit of skepticism out there, and people that don't quite believe this. How do we turn the tide? How do we convince people of the evidence that you presented to us? Easy question.
I'll just share my perspective on this. In my field, I see people scientists using metrics that are completely inappropriate and that make no sense. And so I published a paper that was extremely critical of this one particular metric called kappa. And it turned out to be my most highly cited paper. And then I started reading the people who cited it. And these other scientists said, we used kappa and cited my paper that's entitled Death to Kappa. And so, I mean, if I can't have an influence on my other scientific colleagues who have university degrees and who are publishing in journal articles. I mean, to convince other people on the street that they should be concerned about climate change, I don't know, you ask a very important question, but that just gives like my baseline, you know, of how difficult it is to change people's attitudes and habits. So I don't know if my colleagues have a different approach.
I'll say something that isn't an answer as a solution, but one of the papers that was up on one of the slides when John and I were talking with the lead author of Hirsch, Joey Hirsch, who was an undergrad geography major and was a Hero Fellow, he was really interested in the long tradition at Clark of risk communication and risk hazards research, which is an area in geography that, as I say, has a long tradition at Clark. And he took some of our work looking at how people understand sort of their immediate circumstance. When we looked at the longhorn beetle infestation, one of the dynamics on the sort of the social science side of things was the ways in which people respond because their backyard no longer has squirrels in it because the trees were cut down, or people don't want to hang out on the street anymore in the summer because the trees were cut down, right? And he combined this kind of finding that's very anecdotal and experiential and looked at risk communication, which argued, and then applied it more broadly to the forest product industry in Worcester County, the residential response in city of Worcester and the two neighborhoods that John mentioned, and the city and state response to the longhorn beetle infestation, and argued that you really have to give people motivation and understanding based on their, what in my side of geography we call their relational place, their local place understanding. And so you have to explain what's happening. I mean, people might think walruses are cute or impressive, but until they're able to kind of connect it to what does it mean in my backyard, unfortunately, that's kind of how oriented we are, that if we can situate their own place experience with changes going on, that a lot of it is about communication, which is not any of our expertise, but and there is a special area called risk communication, which is engaged in by geographers, but also other folks and other disciplines, which I think it's about reaching people with what their reference point is.
Well, I would like to thank all of you for attending, and let's give a round of applause to our presenters, Deb Martin, John Rogan, Linda Nestis, Karen Fry.
And Gil Ponchos.
Thank you. So we look forward to interacting with you either immediately after this session, I know I'll be around, or at other events during these wonderful festivities of the inauguration of our new president. Thank you for coming.
Thanks, Gil.
Oh.